you said. Something strange is happening across the vast landmass of Eurasia. Quiet shifts, subtle moves, almost imperceptible to those not watching closely. But if the patterns continue, if the alignments deepen, they could reshape the balance of power, not just on one continent, but across the entire world. At the center of this story are three great nations: Russia, China, and India. Together, they represent more than 3 billion people, enormous reserves of energy, massive military strength, and civilizational legacies that stretch back thousands of years. And yet, their relationships with one another are not built on trust, not on alliance, but on suspicion, on necessity, and on strategy. A triangle of power, fragile, shifting, and decisive for the century ahead. For Moscow, the story begins with survival. Once the heart of the Soviet Union, a superpower locked in global rivalry with the United States, Russia now finds itself weakened, sanctioned, and increasingly isolated from the West. It seeks new lifelines, markets for its energy, buyers for its weapons, and partners who will not lecture it about democracy or human rights. In Beijing, it finds an eager customer. In New Delhi, a reluctant but necessary friend. For Beijing, the story is ambition. China has risen from the chaos of the 20th century to become the world's second-largest economy, a global manufacturing hub, and a power with aspirations that stretch from Africa to the Arctic. But its rise has not been uncontested. Washington watches with suspicion. Tokyo strengthens its defenses. The Indo-Pacific becomes a battleground of influence. In this environment, China sees Moscow as a shield against Western pressure, and India as both a rival to be contained and a market too large to ignore. For New Delhi, the story is autonomy. India has always sought to walk its own path, not fully aligned with Washington, not submissive to Moscow, not deferential to Beijing. Strategic independence is its creed. Yet independence comes at a cost. India still relies heavily on Russian arms, trades deeply with China despite mistrust, and courts the West for technology and investment. Every move requires balance. Every choice carries consequences. This is the triangle shaping Eurasia. It is not a friendship. It is not a formal alliance. It is something stranger, a constant negotiation of necessity, rivalry, and opportunity. And in this negotiation lies the fate of the century. The Russia-India bond is perhaps the oldest strand. For decades, Moscow has been New Delhi's arsenal. From MiG fighter jets to nuclear submarines, from tanks to missile systems, Russia supplied what India needed to defend itself against Pakistan, against China, and against uncertainty. Even today, more than half of India's military equipment originates from Russia. Oil, too, flows from Russian ports to Indian refineries, especially after the war in Ukraine drove Moscow to offer steep discounts. But this bond is under stress. As Russia leans more heavily on China, India worries that Moscow will no longer be able to balance its commitments. The very partner that once helped India counter Beijing is now growing closer to it. For New Delhi, this creates a dilemma. Maintain ties with Moscow and risk entanglement with Beijing, or pivot away and risk losing decades of defense cooperation. Meanwhile, the China-Russia partnership grows stronger. Sanctioned and isolated from the West, Moscow has few options. Beijing provides markets for energy, technology partnerships, and diplomatic cover. In return, China gains cheap oil, gas, and a strategic ally in its competition with Washington. Together, they present a formidable front, conducting joint military exercises, coordinating positions in the United Nations, and speaking of a multipolar world order that challenges U.S. dominance. And yet, beneath the surface, mistrust remains. Russia has no desire to be a junior partner in a Chinese-led world. China has not forgotten its historical clashes with Moscow, nor does it fully trust Russian unpredictability. Their partnership is born of necessity, not love. But necessity, in geopolitics, can be powerful enough to endure. For India, this creates the most delicate balance of all. On one hand, it cannot afford to alienate Russia, the supplier of its weapons and a partner in energy. On the other, it cannot ignore the threat from China, a neighbor with whom it shares a tense border, a competitor in Asia, and an increasingly assertive presence in the Indian Ocean. The result is a foreign policy tightrope, one that requires India to engage with Beijing in forums like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, even as it deepens ties with the United States, Japan, and Australia through the Quad. The West watches with caution. Washington hopes India can serve as a counterweight to China, but questions New Delhi's unwillingness to condemn Moscow over Ukraine. Europe seeks trade with India, but wonders how far its neutrality can stretch. Japan and Australia invest in defense cooperation with India, but remain unsure of its ultimate loyalties. For them, India is both an opportunity and an uncertainty. This is the paradox of the triangle. Russia needs China, but fears dependence. China needs Russia, but does not fully trust it. India needs both, but cannot afford to rely too much on either. And yet, together, they hold the keys to Eurasia. The question is simple, but profound. Can this triangle hold, or will it fracture under the weight of history, ambition, and mistrust? Because if it holds, the world may see the rise of a Eurasian bloc that challenges Western dominance, reshapes global trade, and redraws the map of power. But if it breaks, the consequences may be just as great. Rivalries, conflicts, and crises that spread far beyond Eurasia itself. And so the world watches. Every handshake, every summit, every joint statement is dissected in Washington, in Brussels, in Tokyo. Because in this strange triangle lies not just the fate of Russia, China, and India. In it lies the future of Eurasia, and, perhaps, the fate of the century.